All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being on for this webinar on Saturday. I'm Ankur Patel, Director of Advancement for Hindu University of America, and we're going to be digging into this issue, Hindus for Black Lives and the struggle for truth and justice. It's important for us as Hindus to engage in these important conversations. And even if they're controversial, it's good to have different perspectives and conversations and think about things. And that's how I got into this, right? We have Hindu University of America is a platform for Hindus to share their voices, opinions, ideas, and have an impact on these important issues at the global level and in America specifically. One of the courses that I took that really put me on this path is Orientation to Hindu Studies, where we ask these questions, we engage with the university and figure out how we as Hindus can make an impact and restore, rejuvenate our culture and history in context of the modern world. So I highly encourage you to register for Orientation to Hindu Studies as part of the conversation that we're having. And again, today we're here for this webinar, Hindus for Black Lives and the Struggle for Truth and Justice. Our two panelists today are Justin Marks and Indu Vishwanathan. And let me just introduce both of them briefly. So Justin, I actually known Justin for about 10 years. He's a graduate from Cal State University Northridge with a degree in Pan-African Studies. I was actually at CSUN with him back in 2010, 2014. He's combined his scholarship and lived experience. Justin is a community organizer, policy advocate, and visual artist working to build power with working class people. In 2018, Justin studied in Brazil as a political educator with an international cohort of 60 organizers from 30 different countries. Prior to this, Justin worked at the Liberty Hill Foundation as a strategic manager for two LA countywide alliances, the Brothers, Sons, Selves Coalition and the Queer and Trans Youth of Color Task Force. Justin is a member of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles and is now working as a fund development consultant for social justice organizations, including the Youth Justice Coalition in South Central Los Angeles. We're definitely going to hear more from Justin and his personal story. Let me now introduce Indu Vishwanathan, who is a doctoral candidate in teacher education at Teachers College, Columbia University. Her research focuses on the transnational consciousness of second-generation Indian American teachers. This is a very interesting concept. I only learned about it because of her, but as an American-born Hindu and an Indian, I've had this transnational consciousness, and I think this is an important concept we're going to develop. She is a second-generation Hindu American herself, raising third-generation Hindu American children. In addition to having experienced how Hinduism is taught in American schools as a student and now as a mother, she's also keenly aware of how the narrative about Hinduism as it relates to issues of social justice is controlled by a small group of influencers who don't seem open to scholarly liberal dissent. She's committed to adding more voices to the conversation, and we're glad to have her on this panel today. Before we hand it over to our panelists, let me give it over to Sri Kalyan Vishwanathan, the president of Hindu University of America, who is going to give us a little bit of framing before we jump into it. Kalyanji, let me hand it over to you. Thank you.
Terrific, terrific. Thank you, everybody. Welcome to this conversation today. I'm going to share a few slides to kind of set a framework for the discussion. And then I think the panelists will take it from there. So let me share my screen to begin with. Oops, sorry. That was the wrong screen. Let me go to, all this works like that. Okay, here we are. So we are calling this webinar Hindus for Black Lives and the Struggle for Truth and Justice. we are clearly living through an extraordinary moment of American history, but world history in a certain sense. Okay, let me address briefly the people who are raising your hands. Can you please kindly type your question or comment into the chat window, if you could please, okay? Before we'd like as participants to hear the conversation first before asking questions and comments. But kindly, if you have something urgent to say, you can type it into the chat window. Okay. So are you able to see my screen? Ankur, are you able to see my screen? Hello, Ankur,
Yes,
are you
yes,
able to see?
yes, yes.
Okay, good, good. All right, very good. So, as I was saying, it's a very extraordinary moment in world history, really speaking, because it is not only the confluence of the coronavirus pandemic, which has substantially affected the entire world and placed us all into a period of extreme uncertainty. But also, we have this moment of reckoning, which is arisen from the unfortunate and tragic demise of George Floyd. Now, to put things in perspective, colonialism and its legacy is something that uh, both Hindus and African Americans share. So the chart here on the right side shows the world, the part of the world that has been under colonial rule at one time or another. And as you can see very well, India and Africa were all brought under the heel of colonial rule for hundreds of years. So the question that we have before us is the struggle for truth and justice a never-ending one? And how do we move past the horrors of this era? But just to sort of look at some of the origins, just to remind ourselves how it all started, right? So I put a few dates here. It's interesting that it all starts with Pope Nicholas V. He issues the bull Romanus Pontifex, granting the Portuguese a permanent monopoly in trade with Africa. It's an important example of the papacy's claim to spiritual lordship of the whole world and of its role in regulating relations, not only among the Christian princes, meaning the various European states or Christian states of the time, and between the Christians and unbelievers, which is the heathens and infidels. 1455. 1493, Pope Alexander VI issues the papal bull or decree called the Intersect, in which he authorizes Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas and its native peoples as subjects. The decree asserts the rights of Spain and Portugal to colonize, convert, and enslave. It also justifies the enslavement of Africans. Moving on to 1600 CE, a part of our own history, in the Hindu history, the East India Company was formed through a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I in December 1600. The British were late entrants to this trade, world trade, if you will, coming in the heels of the Spain, of the Portuguese, the Dutch, and so on. Before then, the Portuguese had already started trading with India in much of the 16th century, and the Dutch companies had also sailed into India from 1595. Now, that's of course recent trade. There's also been a lot of ancient trade with India for a long period. 1619 CE. This is an important date in African history because some 20 plus first Africans arrive in the British colony of Virginia, and they're the first slaves brought into North America. And over a period of little over 200 years, by 1860, there was nearly 4 million enslaved African people in the United States, making up roughly about 13% of the total US population. Here's the last bit, 1660. And the British get into the game and they start what is called as the Royal African Company, which is a mercantile trading company, much like the East India Company. It was set up by the Duke of York, who later becomes the King of England, King James II, and it shipped more African slaves to the Americas than any other institution in the history of Atlantic slave trade. Just a little piece of history for us to kind of, remember as we come into current time. The African slavery timeline, 1619, slavery begins, 1776. The Declaration of American Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That was said in 1776. 1864 million enslaved. 1865, the Civil War, bitterly fought over slavery. 1870s, the Jim Crow laws begin. 1965, end of segregation. In 2020, we come to our John Floyd moment in time. And the India's slavery timeline of servitude, 1600, East India Company formed. 1661, the first British port is established in Bombay. 1674, Calcutta becomes British headquarters in India. 1757, Britain controls Bengal and begins taxation of India. 1857, 100 years later, First War of Independence. 1885, the formation of the Indian National Congress. 1947, India's independence, and we come to our own time here. Now, the point of this is, because I have not mentioned both Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who both created, respectively, they created histories in how to struggle against powerful people when you don't have any power at all. Okay. Now, I want to bring the conversation to current time and start with a question. How do we understand and assimilate the concept of systemic racism as distinct from an individual act of racism? And it's understandable when somebody is racist out of a prejudice individually, but what is systemic racism? Okay, with that question, I want to turn it over to both Justin Andrew Marks and Indu Vishwanathan. Please unmute yourself. You can begin the conversation. Here, unmute yourself.
Good morning.
Please.
Good morning. Yes, thank you, Kalyanji and Indu. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. As Encore mentioned, I'm a member of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, and wanted to first also give an introduction to what that is. I know that many people understand Black Lives Matter to be a hashtag, or to be a political statement, or to be a movement, or to be something that's scribed on pieces of cardboard and hoisted in the streets. Black Lives Matter is also a network-based organization of 27 chapters across the US, the UK, and Canada. I was first introduced to Black Lives Matter after the death of Keisha Michael and Marquentin Sandlin in Inglewood, California. Keisha Michael is a mother of 4 boys, and Marquentin Sandlin, the father of 3 girls. And a week after Valentine's Day, the 2 of them went on a date. And after the date, they pulled over and fell asleep in their cars. And the next day, the mayor of Inglewood would say that the police spent 45 minutes trying to rouse them or to try to wake them up. And that the Inglewood Police Department ended up firing 31 bullets into them, leaving their 7 children orphaned. The Black Lives Matter local chapter met with this family, and we outlined for them what justice looks like. What would it mean for them to have the truth? And that's exactly what they outlined as justice, was just to know what happened. And so there were 5 things that they saw justice as, definitely squarely based on finding out the truth of what happened. So they wanted the release of the body cam footage and the video footage from the city and streets and local restaurants. They wanted a release of the internal investigation that was being conducted by the Inglewood Police Department. They also wanted a reparations fund or some support for these now orphaned 7 children. And then they also wanted those 5 officers who fired these shots to be fired, and then for them to have their day in court and prosecuted. And for 2 years, this family, Keisha Michael is a twin sister, Trisha Michael, and who was politicized by this moment, is Belizean born. We went and exhausted all of the forms of regress and opportunities to speak directly to these folks, decision makers in power, including the city council and the mayor. And for 2 years, they were denied. There were violations of the Brown Act in terms of closing down meetings to avoid having this accountability. And after 2 years, we were able to get a release of that footage. Once they retained legal representation, they were able to have access to the investigative report. As a community, we fundraised to help support those 7 children. And then one Memorial Day in Inglewood, there was an action, there was a demonstration by community members supporting this family, in which, surrounded by other Black veterans in Inglewood, respectfully, one young activist got on the mic and said that, you all fought for our rights to be heard and for us to be able to seek and have access to truth and justice in this country, in this city. One of the House of Representatives was there, Maxine Waters, and instead of dismissing the young boy, he said, "Oh, come on, baby, and pulled him on stage. And they sat next to it, and a week later, all 5 of those officers were fired, as the shooting was found to be outside of policy. When this family went to go try to seek justice in court, the decision maker at that point was in Los Angeles County, the district attorney, Jackie Lacey. And Jackie Lacey refused to prosecute the officers. And then also there were about 500, at that time, about 500, now the number is about 605 people who had been killed by police in Los Angeles County with no prosecution, no indictments, even when police commissions and those oversight bodies had ruled these things to be out of policy and deserving of further investigation. This is when the campaign to launch to have the district attorney removed from Los Angeles County to be able to, that's when that started. And so for 2 years, we have shown up. And I think that this story is pertinent in answering the question of what systemic racism is, because that is the story and the legacy of Black people in this country, that it is not only systemic racism that we're talking about, but it is being locked out of the avenues afforded to American citizens to be able to receive justice. It is not only in the criminal justice system, and not only with regards to police accountability, but we're also talking about education. We are talking about infant mortality rates and the death and the fact that you can find Black people, Black women, and Black trans women at the bottom of every social statistic and measurable income of quality of life and lifestyle. That is tied to some of the history in terms of looking at the, what is between the lines when they say that all men are created equal in this country, that at the same time, those men were writing that they themselves were slave owners, that there were Africans enslaved during this time that they only considered to be 3/5 of a person, not whole, and that this has been in the background and in the foreground for our realities throughout this time, even with, these, you might see a LeBron James, you might see a Barack Obama or a Jay-Z. And when it's like, well, if we can have such success, how can there still be systemic racism? What is anti-Blackness? And so I am interested in continuing this conversation, but I also had a chance to speak with Indu, and I know that she's also been doing anti-racist work and anti-colonial work for the last 2 decades. And so I'd also invite her to speak on this description of systemic racism.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Again, thank you all for having me on here. And it's an honor to be speaking with you, Justin. And I was really happy to speak with you last night as well. For me, when I think about how to answer that question about systemic racism, in addition to really illustrative examples like what Justin just shared, what I have found the most powerful and like my aha moment was when I read Stamped from the Beginning by Professor Ibram X. Kendi. It is such a powerful reframing that I think applies not just to anti-racism or to understanding how racism works, but actually how coloniality works as well. So I think it's a powerful framing. So what he does is kind of flip what we think is common sense about racism on its head. So the common idea is that people have, one group of people in power has a negative viewpoint of another group of people and then has discriminatory ideas and then creates policies that represent those biases. And what Kendi suggests in Stamped from the Beginning is that actually that's quite ahistorical. What the actual origin of racism is that you have a certain group of people who want to maintain power or grab power or resources or whatever it is. And in order to do that, in order to create policies that benefit them at the detriment of another group of people, they create these lines of thought that are discriminatory, these ways of thinking about those groups of people that are discriminatory, that justify the policies, so that eventually the biases towards those groups of people feel like common sense. They become normal, sort of commonsensical, yeah, like I see that, I understand why, because I've observed that about that group of people as well, so that it becomes so deeply rooted in you that that those policies are logical. They seem to make sense. I mean, we know from our experience in India, we know from our experience with colonialism in India, that this is exactly how Hinduism was portrayed. This is exactly how polytheism and all of the things that we believed in were portrayed, that these things are so backwards that we're helping these people by creating these policies, right? So for me, that's really a powerful framing. And as we're thinking about this sort of timeline that Kalenji shared at the beginning of this call, I think that's a great depiction of what we're taught. We're taught about this march towards progress, that these things are evolving. But what we're not taught with the hidden curriculum of policy and reality and all of these examples like what Justin shared is that these things just become, maybe on some level, yes, there are absolutely improvements. You know, we no longer have enslavement, but the practices and the enactment of racist policies are justified in much more insidious ways, right? So if you've had the opportunity, and I highly recommend watching Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th, because it encapsulates all of this and upends that concept of this march of progress, or this neat march of progress. You'll see that that while yes, technically we had we desegregated schools in Brown versus Board of Education. I'm in New York City. New York City remains one of the most segregated school districts in the country, and the ways that are enacted are through redlining, through, you know, mortgage lending practices, through a host of other practices that are happening at a systemic level, right? And so while it might appear that these things have evened out and that there is a level playing field, I think we need to keep in mind that it's very important for everything to appear to be a level playing field, but it's important for us to dig underneath and understand if that's what's really happening. And so that's how I think about systemic. If we look at the history of policing and the origin of policing in this country, it seems like common sense to think that the police are here for our protection. But when you look at the history of policing in the South, The police force was created literally to keep slaves from escaping and from finding their enslaved people from actually successfully liberating themselves, which they did. It was to keep enslaved people in check. That's the origin of policing in this country. So if you think about the fact that policies and practices still exist in order to imprison African Americans at a higher rate than anyone in the world, and that those policies of policing and imprisonment are justified through narratives that are woven about Black bodies, about Black boys, so that it seems to be common sense to imprison them, then you begin to see that the modern day police force is nothing but a modern iteration of the kind of police force that existed in the very beginning, 200 years ago. So that's what I would say. And then in terms of education and my work in education, I mean, you know, like a brief history of education without wanting to say too much, but we know that enslaved people in the South fundraised with whatever money they had and created their own schools. And even well-intended philanthropists from the North went in and said, we're going to help formerly enslaved people by building schools. And they actually took the schools and the ownership and the direction of the schools from these Black folk who had created schools for themselves, and substituted their Black teachers with white teachers because they felt that that was giving them a better education. So you see how like every effort to that has been made by the African American community to actually stand in their power and their truth and actually create spaces institutionally for themselves have been taken over, right? Time and time and time and time again. And so when universal education became mandatory around the time of the Industrial Revolution, which was something that was pushed forward by the National Association of Manufacturers, not by educational scholars, it was created, mandatory universal education was created in order to create an oversupply of laborers for factories in the United States because of the onset of the Industrial Revolution. The problem then became, well, if everyone's qualified, then white graduates won't get the privilege of getting these jobs. So what did they do? They created special education and special education policies that once again pathologized Black children and other children of color to put them in a separate category, their behaviors, their actions, their way of thinking, their way of communicating into a separate category. So to once again institutionally privilege the white children so that when they graduated, the white children were more qualified for whatever the factory jobs were. That's not to say that special education today does not provide important services for children across the spectrum, but we do continue to see children of color overrepresented in special education. So these things, while there is progress, while there is improvement, we see that these things continue. And so that's how I would engage with this concept of systemic racism.
Well, thank you. You're doing a thesis on this, so I know there's a lot more in there. But we talked about, the parallels and the history, U.S. and India, Hindus and African Americans. Is it a mistake to conflate these two, right, between colonization and racism? And another concept that a lot of Hindus have and questions, I think it prompts a lot of the self-reflection is, look at us Hindus. We came from poor India to this country and have done relatively well. Why? How? What is the difference? Does that systemic racism have different impacts and result differently? And that's a question that I'd pose to each of you, and like your take on that, and maybe your personal experiences with institutional racism or racism, if you could share that.
Justin, would you like to go first? Okay. Thank you for both of those questions. I could write a thesis on both of those. But in a nutshell, I would say it's very important for us to separate work from anti-colonial work or decoloniality. Racism happens at an identity level. And so anti-racist work happens at an identity level. Coloniality happens at an epistemological level, at the level of how we think about how knowledge is produced and what knowledge is, and what the self even is, and what consciousness, all of these things that we think of when we think of Sanatana Dharma, for instance. Coloniality is dismissing that knowledge tradition. So it's not it may present itself at an identity level because you're colonizing a group of people, but what's happening actually is the subversion and the to use a sort of modern woke term, the canceling of a knowledge tradition, and the imposing of this concept of, you know, well, this is a modern way of thinking that's superior, and we're going to save you from your way of thinking, right? Versus anti-racism, which is the oppression of people based on their identities. So it's not to say that there's not an overlap, but they're not the same thing. And so the work is very, very different. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm happy to answer more questions about that. Your second question, which is really around this concept of model minority, I think is a really important one for us to engage in as Hindu Americans. I would say it's helpful to think about the success of, and I don't think that we can describe either the Indian American community or the Hindu American community as a monolith. There is a lot of diversity, right? So when we say Hindu Americans, we're thinking of the really, really successful ones, but there are folks, and this has come up in my research, there are folks who have not experienced ease and success in coming up in the United States. So when we're talking about that, let's understand we're talking about class, and we're not just talking about religion or national origin. We're talking about a specific class of Hindu Americans. Rather than saying we've experienced success, I think it's helpful to think of it that we have been permitted to experience success in order to propel the myth of meritocracy. And we can see a similar story, a parallel story in colonial India. It is simply divide and conquer. You allow a certain group of people to be successful, not only to oppress the remainder of that group, but to propel this idea that, well, we are fair. See, we're fair. We're letting this group succeed. Therefore, if you're not succeeding, then that's on you. And so in that way, model minority is not a positive thing. Model minority is, I would describe it as a golden muzzle. Will permit you to be successful as long as you're quiet about things and don't speak out. So.
Yes, and I would just add, and to echo the book and the author, Indu, that you mentioned, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, is stamped from the beginning, and also How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I think that the distinction about I'm not racist. You know, my best friend is Black. I have Black nephews. They're, you know, I would have voted for Obama 3 times if I could. That statements like those fall short, and that also in this moment we are seeing major corporations, Nike and presidential candidates and so many others talk about their solidarity with the Black community and a denouncing of all types of racism, anti-Blackness, and but not necessarily naming the myth of white supremacy. And that I think being an anti-racist is what we implore this audience and any other folks who, again, recognize that systemic racism is real, want to do something about it, and recognizing that this is a civil rights moment of our time. And that if you wanted to know what you would have done in America in the 60s with Martin Luther King, that this is that moment to find out that your character is revealed by you know, by these struggles. I see a question in the chat that I want to respond to as well. It says, from Kalyanji, actually, I just lost the question, but I think it's something like, are police the enemy? Is that what it is?
Yeah, so let's take it this way, Justin.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, are Black people jailed at a higher rate compared to crimes by Black people in relation to white people being jailed at a lower rate compared to crimes by white people, for example?
Short answer, yes.
Yes.
Black people are far more overrepresented in prison than white people. And I think in Ibram X. Kendi's book, he also lifts up the fact that the pathologies that we place on Black communities, that there's this idea that there's a Black behavior and that is somehow connected to crime. But we can see it with the war on drugs in this country, this political and political cultural stance that emerged in the 80s and 90s to have petitions of politicians on both sides of the American, kind of bicameral system to say that we are going to take a tough stance on crime, and that means that we are going to punish and we're going to incarcerate our way out of drug dependency and out of substance abuse. But what we find and what the data shows is that in terms of Black and white in this country, Black folks and white folks who are identified that way in the US, that there is about the same level of drug use in both communities. However, Black people are disproportionately stopped. And so we're talking about contact, we're talking about arrest, we're talking about conviction and incarceration. And at each level of the criminal justice system, there is a disproportion. And it is also compounded by class, because we have in this country a bail system that allows that it is better to be rich and guilty than innocent and poor, or not guilty and poor. And I think that is also what is the evidence and the result of these years of redlining, of being locked out of education, but not of any inherent flaw within the Black community or Black people, and that we too are not monolithic. I think that right now across the country, I'd be remiss if I didn't echo what the streets are saying. The streets are telling us to defund the police. That is a controversial statement, almost as controversial as it was to say Black Lives Matter 5 years ago. Now we've seen a shift. We have opened up this conversation. I would not be speaking to you if it were not for not only George Floyd, but also the activists and the folks who went out into the streets, recognizing that change does not come only from protest, but that it is an effective strategy. But there is also the education, the communication, and the activism that folks engage in on different levels, inside their homes, at their workplaces, at the ballot box, in lobbying and talking directly with politicians, but also in getting to know their neighbors, also in getting to be able to have hard conversations with one another around anti-Blackness as it relates to colorism, which can be found across the world as a result of colonization, and again, this myth of white supremacy. But I offer very strong critiques of them of myself, of who I identify as an oppressor or of an enemy, and also of our movements and resistance. And I think that that's healthy. But to translate what defund the police means is to say that the U.S. is addicted to incarceration. And that there is, and when I say addicted to incarceration, it means that we use police to solve every social ill, whether it be homelessness, whether it be mental illness, whether it be domestic violence, whether it be poverty, whether it be substance abuse or other things. And how do I know this? I know this because in Los Angeles County, the largest provider of mental health care is Men's Central Jail. It's a they call it colloquially Twin Towers Jail. So this is a prison in Los Angeles County that houses the largest population of folks with mental illness. I also know this because my brother is a veteran who served in the Navy and was experienced trauma and has since been incarcerated, again, dealing with mental illness. I talked to him last night. We're writing his parole letter, but I know this, and it pains me to see that every time he's gone in to jail, he's come back to us in pieces, a little bit less of what he was beforehand, and that the brutality and the myth of care that is supposed to be administered inside these prisons is not a place that we heal. I also know this because my father has been an LAPD officer for 31 years. And hearing stories from him again about the dismay and the disappointment and the frustration that many officers have to be social workers, to be teachers, to be marriage counselors, to fill all these roles. Again, recognizing that there is a stated interest, that there are economic profits that are made by the incarceration of people, by the U.S. incarcerating more in the land of the home and land of the free and the home of the brave. We incarcerate more people than any other country in the world. And again, predominantly Black folks are filling these cages, even though in the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen a decline in crime. We have seen an uptick in the budgets for policing and for prisons. Ava DuVernay's movie 13th talks about the ways in which, even though, Kalyanji, you talked about emancipation, and recently we just celebrated Juneteenth, the Black Independence Day. We know that slavery exists and that the 13th Amendment has a clause at the end of it. Behind a comma, it says, except for where there was a crime committed. So that slavery is over except for when crime has been committed. And so that today are certain brands like Victoria's Secret, or your university's tables and chairs, or at California State University, Northridge, they supply desks and chairs made by incarcerated people. That's 2020. That's to this day, CalPIA. And that these things are all wrapped up into systemic racism, anti-Blackness. But again, I say it doesn't stop here. But I think to respond to this moment and to lift this up and to echo again what folks in all 50 states are saying, what we saw in Minneapolis, why we see LAUSD, the second largest school district in the US, moving to end its contract with its own police department, why Oakland just passed that and defunded and separated that contract. That is why we are saying this. But I'm seeing some more comments and questions in there. So Indu, I guess I'd also want to hear a little bit from you in terms of this question around policing and incarceration.
So can I frame it a little bit?
Sure.
It's the same question, right? See, I'm seeing a lot of angst in some of the chats that's coming up. How do we distinguish between legitimate policing, the fighting of crime, legitimate policing of crime, and the systemic racism that seems to impact the African American community in such a disproportionate way? Clearly defund the police seems like such a radical step to take on the one hand, whereas from the Hindu community, at least, we tend to look upon the police as a necessary and legitimate, community to keep law and order in the society. So how do you draw the line? How do you kind of distinguish between the two?
Yeah, absolutely. First, defund does not mean unfund. That's a common misconception, right? There's a disproportionate amount of money put into certain aspects of the police that could go into other things that would help uplift and support the community and communities. So I think it's important to understand what defund means. I think that's a little bit of a confusing term, and there's some literature that I can share afterwards that helps explain how that works. The second thing, and I was talking to Justin about this last night, a study just came out from the University of Chicago. They looked at the 20 largest police departments in the United States, and not a single one of them meets basic universal human rights regulations. So when we think about, and we have this notion that the police are there to, I heard you say two things: protect us. So obviously, if the 20 largest police departments in the country are not even meeting basic human rights regulations, that notion of the police protecting us is pretty dodgy. It's not really fact-based. And the second is this idea of law and order. Law and order, I don't know if this is known that much in the Indian community, because I've heard it emerging from Indian discussion spaces, but law and order is a particular term that was evoked in that same period that Justin was speaking to earlier in the 80s, around the time of the war on drugs. And it was specifically used in concert with this idea of Black men being predators in society, right? And Hillary Clinton even, I think, coined the term super predator. So law and order has a very particular anti-Black origin story in the United States. So it's not simply this sort of neutral idea that we can all agree on, that there needs to be sort of this maintenance of peace in the land. Law and order goes back to this idea of keeping formerly enslaved people and their descendants in their place. And the third part of that I'll say is this sort of reasonable notion of, criminals should be, should pay for their crimes. But it's important to understand that criminality is determined by the laws around what crimes are. And as Justin said earlier, not only is there an over application of the laws of criminality to certain communities, to the Black community, but for instance, an intentional criminalization of the behaviors of Black people. So for instance, the specific drugs that Black people use versus the drugs that rich white people use, you criminalize one, or you create laws around stronger laws around one particular group's behavior, and all of a sudden that group is behaving more criminally, right? And so that's what systemic means. It doesn't mean an evenly decided set of rules. It doesn't just mean an evenly decided set of rules and then an application of those rules in a biased way. It also means an uneven creation of rules based on the behaviors of different communities.
I would just add quickly, and yes, the chat box is on fire, and I love it. But I would want to respond to a couple different things. One is the effect. The first community organizer that I ever knew was my father. I'm the son of a preacher. We're the ones that you have to watch out for. But I saw him as someone who was meeting. I saw himself as someone who was meeting the immediate needs of people in the church, that community, whether it be housing, whether it be all these things. That was his role. But in policing, you are often, because you are responding to people in the most crisis moments, and there's this antagonistic history that it has, and I love my father, but it has eaten away at the empathy, his capacity to empathy, and created somewhat of a callous on his heart. And I think that is, there is also research and studies about that. For those folks who don't believe me, there is, you can look at Skolnick's theory, which outlines kind of like three main factors: the fact that police culture requires a certain efficiency with which to do it, the high risk, and then also the class, that there is a certain, that is what creates this thin blue line, and furthers the distance between police and the community, that they're, that on the side of the cars it says to serve and protect. The application of law and order and what we see is also disproportionate. So in communities, in poor and working class communities, you can call 911 and you can get no response. There could be some violence perpetrated and you'll not see police present. Versus when we may have, again, in Los Angeles, my context, where you may have, some wealthy folks or some white folks come through town, and you'll see like police escorts. And so I think subconsciously, even down to children, what that says is that our life doesn't matter. But and I think that is also behind this affirmation and this call to say that Black lives matter. And so I wanted to lift that point, just in terms of the way that policing and law and order is exacted in our communities, and to also talk about the kind of corrosive features that it has, not just on those who may be subject to arrest, but also to those officers involved. You have seen, and you're seeing more so folks stepping back away from that job, and we're having different conversations. Defunding the police, to me, is pretty clear, and it means, I think, what folks are saying it means. It means that security, safety is about resources and not more police. I worked both in Inglewood and in Beverly Hills. And in Inglewood, you would see liquor store, laundromat, weed shop now. And on the Beverly Hills side, on Wilshire, you'll see a Cedars-Sinai hospital. You'll see a dentist office. You'll see more access to healthcare, mental health care, more access. You'll see a Whole Foods and a Sprouts, and you'll have more options for people to be able to take care of themselves. But yet there's more police in Inglewood. Why does...
Oh, did we lose him?
Yeah, it looks like Justin froze just right now. We'll wait for him to get back on. Indrajit, did you want to pick up from where he left off? Or, let me just say a few words while we get back on. This conversation is so important. There's a lot of different opinions and ideas. As Hindus, this is important. Again, I want to emphasize, this is about engaging in an important topic, raising the voice of Hindus. And some of the chat says, why aren't Hindus and Blacks working together better, especially on education? Well, guess what? We're right here at Hindu University of America having this important conversation, and we want you to be a part of this. Even if you have other opinions and you're not feeling that you're being represented right now, we're trying to do our best, and we're going to incorporate questions and et cetera. But we want you to participate with Hindu University of America, and the single best way that you can join this is by enrolling. And the specific class that we want you to enroll in is Orientation to Hindu Studies. It gives an outline of HUA, what the different areas of studies are. And over 11 weeks, we have deep conversations on a range of important issues. I don't think we're going to have a specific class on this, but using HUA as a platform to have these important conversations is where we're at, and we need you to participate. Thank you for all your questions in the chat, and we, again, highly encourage you to enroll in Orientation to Hindu Studies. So we got Justin back. I think Kalyanji wants to reframe the question. We're at 9:53, so let's keep this thing moving.
I just want to say one thing. See, I think it's very important. Justin, we lost you for a little bit there, so I'll come right back to you. Just keep. Okay. See, I think clearly the chat window is showing a tremendous amount of passion, as you said. There are people who want to express very strong opinions, and on both sides. On the side of wanting to be fully in solidarity with the African American community, on the one hand. And also on the side of saying that, the African American community is responsible for not lifting itself up on its own and trying to take advantage of the freedoms that America has offered, which very oftentimes the Hindu community does genuinely believe they have been afforded, and they've been allowed to become reasonably successful in this country. So there are two sides here. There are definitely two sides amongst the Hindu community. Now, I think the most important thing I would like to say to the very passionate amongst the audience here is that the purpose of these seminars, these webinars, is for us to hear alternate voices, not to come here and offer our own opinion all over again, because certainly, we all have opinions, but we want to learn from Justin Marks as to how he sees the world and how he is processing this unique moment in history. And we want to hear from Indu Vishwanathan how she is understanding this moment and what she can share from the way she's been studying these issues. With that, Justin, back to you to complete your thought that you kind of lost you there for a bit.
Well, I think what you said was interesting in terms of the things in the chat.
Yeah.
I know that in order for that, I'll say it like this. I'm sorry. That in order that any successes that we've had as a country, the things and victories that we point to in the civil rights, what that allowed for immigrants from all over the world to be able to matriculate into through higher education and to be able to find success in the U.S. rode on the coattails of the fights for Black liberation, and that one of the principles that I would share in terms of the way that I see the world and the women, the Black women and the other leaders that I listen to, the books that we've mentioned here and those artists, is that when we look at the again, some of the folks who are most affected and find themselves at the intersections of the oppressions that I'm assuming that we can agree exist, whether it be racism, classism, seeing heterosexuality as the norm and the dominant and what is okay and acceptable, seeing men as being the ones who are leaders, so heteronormative patriarchy, classism, racism, that you will find poor Black trans women. And that if we live in a society that allows for those folks to thrive and to have access to healthcare, to be able to be afforded the American dream, then it means that we all get free. When those folks get free, that's when we all get free. And I am offering this not as a debate, and that's not why I joined the conversation. The reason why I joined this conversation is to speak to an audience that is interested in finding out more, but also to kind of clear the record in terms of how we got to this point, and especially for those folks in California and in Los Angeles. But there is definitely a lot of victories and reforms and things that we have seen over the last 10 years, over the last 30 years, and before. That in my hometown, Lancaster, California, the largest employer is the military Air Force base, Boeing, which makes bombs and weapons, the prison, Lancaster State Prison, and then Walmart. That I think is reflective. If you ask me what your priorities are, either as a country or as a family, I can look at your budget and that will speak more loudly than what principles you articulate to me eloquently or else. You can say that you stand for something, but I think that recognizing that war and the prison industrial complex, more so than education, more so than these things that we know that make us feel safe, more so than the things that you use to determine what area and community you're going to live in, and those bottom thresholds is the same things that folks are calling for when they say defund the police. There is an ample amount of representation to affirm that Black lives don't matter. There is, I think what Indu talked about and referenced previously in Ibram X. Kenny's book around the hegemony, the epistemological start and foundations of these things that affect us, that it is deep rooted. There is also another a white sociologist, a woman whose name I'm blanking now, but she has the black doll, white doll test, in which she sits young children down and has them choose between which doll that they find to be good and bad. And it's taught at a very young age. And so again, I offer these things as evidence, but also as things to be aware of and to equip those of you watching to continue to educate your community, your parents, your families, and your homes about ways that you can get involved. I'll bring it back to that hometown that in the last 3 years there was a proposal by Los Angeles County to place another prison. They wanted to build a mental health prison in Los Angeles County, and that activists, that community organizations, like Justice LA, Dignity and Power Now, the Youth Justice Coalition, Critical Resistance, that they fought this and they told the community, no, we need a decentralized community-based care in Los Angeles County. And that $3.2 billion that was going to be spent on this prison was now shifted into resources to be spread throughout Los Angeles County. And that is a victory. Those are things that we claim. Just last week, on the state level, there was the victory of AB 1460, which required that ethnic studies be a mandate for anyone going through the CSU system. These are some of the victories that I lift up that I think are going to make a difference. And we're talking about the distribution of resources and also dismantling some of those hegemonic reinforcements of anti-Blackness and systemic racism. Inda, did you also want to speak to that?
I mean, everything you said is so amazing. I hate to speak after you, but I will say I want to go back actually to this sort of binary that Kalyanji painted of the two sides of this. And I know you weren't intending to paint it as a binary, but I would say my feeling, and I think because I have existed in this space, and there's a vast space in between where Hindus and Hindu Americans might be sitting and wondering and concerned, because we feel and we've seen currently, it's heightened, but we've seen it over the past 100, 200 years, colonizing theories about us and the application and the misapplication and the retrofitting of race theories. And we saw that a couple of weeks ago. I was here watching a brilliant webinar on this, the misapplication of racist race sciences onto the Indic context. And so there's hesitation, there's pause, because we've seen how race theory and the discussion of race has been used to further colonize not just our present and the ways in which we're understanding how to unpack our current Indian and Indic and Hindu society, but actually the way in which our entire history has been rewritten or sort of taken up. And so I understand, I have empathy for folks who are more familiar with that than they are with the reality and the history of African Americans in this country. And so I implore you to study and understand, to understand that a part of our work is to decouple these things. And in order to decouple these things, I think we have to understand this history more, because the more I've learned, and I've spent, again, decades studying this, the more I've learned and understood and engaged, the more I've understood how deeply that misapplication is happening. And the more articulately and clearly I'm able to say, no, actually, this movement right now, first of all, for anyone to co-opt the Black Lives Matter movement and to take that Lives Matter portion of it that people have worked so hard, people have given their lives and their everything for, in order for it to actually have resonance for any group to co-opt that and use that for their own movement, I think is a travesty. That ought not happen. But in addition to that, for people to co-opt it and apply it almost in like a reverse scenario in India, or use it in ways that are I feel are completely inappropriate. I understand the pause about that, but we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, is what I offer. I think the more we educate ourselves, the more we can speak articulately about why some of these things have been misconstrued. And I think there's a lot that our communities have to learn about each other, about our histories, about our struggles, about how racism, about how coloniality work. And so the more conversation we have, the better. I think as an American, as a Hindu American, and I've said this a few times, when my father moved here in 1966, so it was the tail end of the sort of civil rights movement, and he very much had that ethos, and we grew up understanding that we owed a debt to African Americans. That's why we were even able to be here. So I grew up in a very particular household around this. I think it's important for us to understand that when we moved here, this became our karma bhumi as well. We have an obligation to this land as well. And whether or not we understand it and understand how we're inscribed in it, we are a part of it, and and our identities and our successes are weaponized against other people. And simply knowing that, whether or not you understand it fully, I think even knowing that that's possible is worthy of investigation. You might end up feeling like, no, I've earned my success, whatever it is, but isn't it worth it to even investigate it? I would just offer that.
Okay, so I want to, before we close the webinar, I want to ask one question. We've spoken about truth and justice. Now, the word justice is a very sharp word, and I've heard this topic being brought up in the context of truth and reconciliation. Now, some of the panelists also asked this question: is there any hope for reconciliation anytime in the near future, or are we more or less kind of stuck in a kind of a permanent mode of seeking justice, protesting and seeking justice? How do we move? And of course, the white community needs to be part of that conversation. I'm very clear about it. Otherwise, we'll all be just protesting. But what are your thoughts in terms of, is there any potential, any possibility for truth and reconciliation here?
I remember when we spoke Kalyanji, there was this quote, the Martin Luther King, and yes. I think he had taken it from somewhere else, that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Yeah. And
it's a beautiful quote, and I agree with it. But I think the reason that it bends is because people hang on it. Like it needs to be, it needs some help, and time is neutral. Yeah. There is another quote by Frederick Douglass. It says that those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are people who want crops without plowing the ground. Mm-hmm. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both, but it must be a struggle. And in nature, I see that there is a constant tension between life and death, about things being reborn, that the absence of tension or conflict is not justice alone. And that reconciliation to me is desirable, but not as much as freedom is, not as much as justice is, and that protest is necessary. It is written into the DNA of this country as much as racism is, as much as some of these other things, and that there's going to be a tension for that in the world. Yes, I think it's possible. But I think that is not maybe the question. I think that searching for truth, searching for justice but being able to reconcile or to find middle ground with an oppressor is not my goal, or is not the goal of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right, understand. What about you, Induji?
I think reconciliation is a really powerful goal. I think at a systems level, I think it's going to take a while for us to get there, because as Justin has shown us with so many examples over and over again at an individual and at an institutional level, simply having access to something as simple as an existing grievance process, if that's not accessible to someone, then the idea of reconciliation is so far removed, because people are talking about being able to sleep in their bed at night without having the police storm in and shoot them to death, right? So how can we talk about reconciliation when someone can't even be asleep in their bed? That's not to say that reconciliation isn't something that I think we all hope we eventually get to, but I think there are some steps along the way that we have to take. You know, I'm seeing some comments that I kind of do want to address about sort of left, right, and this looks like a CNN panel and all of this. And you know, I understand this is intense. These are intense conversations. I want to be clear in my stance that I don't think it's helpful to immediately categorize someone a Hindu American that just because they stand for Black Lives Matter, that they necessarily agree with the appropriation of the Lives Matter movement in India, and that you can have a very critical and nuanced viewpoint on what's happening in India, and also have a critical and nuanced viewpoint of what's happening here. And I think that we need to actually operate a lot more in that space, because I think it's actually going along with the misappropriation of these movements that is keeping us kind of trapped. And I think that a lot of liberation can happen from decoupling all of this.
Yeah, yeah. And I know that we're coming up on the close. This was fun, believe it or not, for me. And so I do want to thank you, Kalyan ji, Ankur ji, and Indu ji, in inviting me and having here. But yeah, I think in terms of where we started, in terms of some myths, the model minority myth or myths about Black Lives Matter, and this idea of all lives matter or blue lives matter or even saying Hindu lives matter. And I think that was some of the questions that was going around. Yes, of course, all lives matter, but recognizing that all lives matter is a way of dismissing anti-Blackness, systemic racism, that it is a way of, that it is not a movement, and that when we, if these were things on equal footing in terms of saying all lives matter, then you would see, for me, the evidence of people's true belief of that would be them being out in the streets too, when people are killed, regardless of race, that by saying all lives matter, I would want you to be there at Skid Row. And for, you know, at Skid Row in Los Angeles is the largest largest community of unhoused people in the United States. And it's basically like a tent city. And it sits in the shadows of the high rise just on the other side of Hollywood Sign. And that this is, that those folks hardly ever come down, that these statements, and recognize if you find yourself saying this, that why is it that you maybe struggle saying Black Lives Matter and then putting a but on it? But X, Y, and Z. No, standing in solidarity is being able to put a period after that, is by saying Black Lives Matter, or saying all Black Lives Matter, or saying that trans Black Lives Matter. But I think in terms of, you know, doubling down on what Induji had said about the co-optation of the languages, is just that, is that we are continually having to fight just to affirm that, you know, and say, oh, all lives matter, Black Lives Matter, but what about those folks in Chicago who are killing themselves, killing each other? Or if Black Lives Matter, but where we experience racism and oppression too, or I pulled myself up on my bootstraps, and again, more investigation, self-education, and I think explanation, conversation than we can fit into the last minutes of this call is due. But that is what that we lift up. There are a lot of resources. I would implore folks again to listen to Black women, all different types of Black women, and it's and that to also recognize that our solutions are not only going to come out of academia, and for people who wear collared shirts, that they're going to come from young people, they're going to come from poor and working class people, and those who are experiencing these issues. And that that there's a certain amount of privilege that must be acknowledged to be able to sit on an armchair and debate somebody on Facebook or to have these conversations in the comfort of your own home. And again, things that you would not say to people in person. So I want to lift that up, but also recognizing that we must have grace for one another, that we must, that we're fighting together. Is an African proverb that says, if you want to go far, go together. If you want to go quick, go alone. But right now we're doing both. The things that we're seeing in these changes across the country are not new. They're not a result of George Floyd's death. George Floyd's death is tragic. It catalyzed something. What we saw was a crime against humanity. We saw this man take his last breath. And the police officer on his neck had his hands in his pocket and seemed to be enjoying it. And that's why I think it was hard for people to watch. But the same type of energy and attitude that allows for that to happen in the officer Chauvin's mind is the one that exists pervasively, and that we have been spoon-fed in this country and around the world since we were in preschool, since we were in diapers, that there is, that these things exist in us. And so it requires self-reflection before, and it requires a certain self-awareness to understand that you may be triggered about certain things, but explore that. That's what I would ask for folks to do, is to understand why you may refute the narrative given by someone like me or Indu or another speaker, and call for, oh, I need to see more data. I need to, where is your thesis? Where is your proof? Where is your evidence? And understand why that when somebody else, the president of the United States may make claims or some other spokesperson, that you may not always carry that same level of scrutiny. Not saying that scrutiny and academic rigor and that these things in research is not important, but it is there. The evidence is there. The evidence is there. The research is there, and there are folks who have put these things together. Some of the books and authors that have been listed already. There are whole academic disciplines. As a Pan-Africanist and as a graduate with a Pan-African degree, that was 4 or 5 years of study for me, and I recognized that discipline and even the fight to be able to have an ethnic studies, whether it's Indian American studies, Asian American studies, Chicano studies, is the only academic discipline in this country that was birthed through struggle and activism, but it is representative and has connection with working class people in India and all over the world. I recognize that me growing up in Lancaster and Palmdale, that I have more in common with somebody from Palestine than I do with Barack Obama. And I think that those are the types of reflections that we need, that to recognize that myself as a man, yes, I carry, and being raised by a woman that had, it was all boys and a father that recognizing the role that our women play in this culture. And again, I'm speaking for mine and in this context, that these are things that we need to reflect on. As we're talking about freedom, liberation, and the struggle for truth and justice.
Okay, very good, great, excellent. So I would like to first of all acknowledge all the audience for participating with so much energy in the chat window. And Justin, thank you for coming on board today. Thank you for sharing your perspective and how you're experiencing it. I think on the whole, for the Hindu community, it is important for us to move beyond just our opinions and to listen. And I think listening to other voices would be really, really useful. Then we can have well-considered and thoughtful opinions as opposed to simplistic opinions. And that is the entire possibility of the Hindu University of America. And I want to say, Induji, thanks for coming on board at a short notice. We're very glad you joined this discussion. Last but not the least, our next quarter is beginning in a week, about a week to 10 days. First week, second week of July. So, if you want to get started with Hindu studies, the best place to begin is the course called Orientation to Hindu Studies, which is a 1/4 course, about 11 weeks long, and a very engaging and interesting entry point into the world of learning rigorously and systematically. Thank you all. I'd like to say goodbye. Thank you. Namaste. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you all. Namaste.
Bye.
Namaste. Bye-bye. Good night. Bye-bye.
Namaste.